This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and talk to industry experts about debt, money, and personal finance. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
On previous episodes of Debt Free in 30, we've explored how debt impacts different age groups. We've talked about children, millennials, and seniors. Today, we tie it all together. Seniors, parents, millennials, children, they all make up the family. And that's today's topic of discussion. How does debt impact the family? To explore this topic, I've got a great guest today. Her name is Nora Spinks, and she's the CEO of the Vanier Institute of the Family. What's the Vanier Institute? That was my first question for Ms. Spinks. Here's her answer.
Well, the Vanier Institute is a research and education organization based in Ottawa. It's been around for 50 years. It was set up by the Governor General, Georges Vanier, and his wife, Pauline, in the early to mid-60s when families were, in their estimation, undergoing significant change and experiencing a lot of pressure, and wanted to establish an institute that would maintain and monitor and assess families and family life and family experiences, including family finances, forever. So that's where we are, and that's what we do.
And so the Institute has been going on for 50 years now. How does it keep going? Where does it get its funding? What keeps it going?
Well, one of the things that the Vaniers did in their foresight was to set up an endowment fund that allows us to keep the lights on. And so we only need to do fund development for special projects and initiatives, but we don't have to worry about our existence. So we're able to focus on things of importance. We're able to feel confident that we're going to be around for the next 50 years. And so 15 years ago, we decided that we would take a serious look at family finances. And for the last 15 years, we've actually been producing a report analyzing this current state of family finances in Canada.
And so that report you're talking about is called The Current State of Canadian Family Finances, I believe. What are the state of Canadian family finances
today? When we look at family finances, we basically look at three major areas. The first one is income and expenditures. Where is the money coming from? How much is it? Where's the money going? And then we look at savings and debt. So how much is left over? How much are we behind? And the third one is the ultimate wealth and net worth of families. And so when we look at income and expenditures, it's clear that in order to maintain basic standard of living, the average household requires more than one income when you look at average incomes. When we look at savings and debt, we see that household debt is increasing, but it's also much more complicated than ever before. And the kind of debt is as significant as the amount of debt, which we hear about from other sources. And when we look at wealth and net worth, we really look at it through the family lens. And what does it mean when you have multi-generations involved in family finances? And what does that mean for each generation, older, middle, and upcoming generations?
So let's focus in then on number 2 on your list, which is savings and debt, because obviously this show is called Debt Free in 30, so that's a big interest of mine. You said that debt is more complicated. What do you mean by that?
Well, what we do know is that the vast majority of Canadians do have some kind of debt, so about 80% of Canadians have debt. The vast majority of that is related to mortgage. Including mortgages, the average Canadian owes about $93,000. When you look at that and you take homes out of that, the second largest investment that results in debt is a vehicle, a car. And third is sort of repairs and maintenance and operations of both the house and the car. And when all of that's taken care of, then the next major investment is education. Way down the list are things like vacation, health, entertainment, electronics. And so when we look at debt, we recognize that most people accumulate their debt in their most productive years, when they're starting to have children, when they're getting into the housing market, when they're incurring costs associated with education. And so that is sort of the norm. What we are now seeing that's relatively new in sort of historic economics in this country is older people with debt, more people retiring with debt, and more people accumulating debt while in retirement. And so that adds complication to the debt question, because we're more likely to be taking care of the previous generation, our older generations, in supporting our parents or our grandparents in maintaining their households or paying for certain expenses or just incurring our own costs associated with caregiving. We're also trying to manage and maintain our own household expenses while often caring for or supporting young adults in either when they're away at school or starting out in their careers or looking for work, and that may, or paying student debts, and that may add strain to a household income. And then there's divorce, which of course adds even more complication, but there's also remarriages, step families, and much more complication in those relationships, because we tend to live a lot longer today, and because if we divorce, we're much more likely to repartner. And add on top of that, that when we do partner, increasingly we're less likely to form marriages, which adds all kinds of complication when you end up separating or when there's a death in the family.
Wow, and that's a long list of things that are more complicated now than they used to be. And I see what you're saying. If we turn the clock back 50 years ago when your institute first started, a lot of those things you mentioned were uncommon. Divorce was less common, remarriage was even less common, and we didn't have this concept of the sandwich generation, I guess, where I'm caring for both my elderly parents and the younger generation as well. So the impact of that on the family is what? Is it, creating a lot of additional stress? What do you see as the impact on the family of all this debt?
Well, it really depends on the family itself. It depends on how much people talk about finances. People are more likely to share with you their sex life than their financial situation. What we're finding is people are feeling, if they're not financially secure or they have accumulated a great deal of debt, that there's a sense of regret or shame or embarrassment. And there was a recent study done by BMO Financial that showed that 13% are so upset, ashamed, or embarrassed that they avoid looking at their statements and bills. They just can't emotionally get themselves to want to take on managing that responsibility. So if you think about 50 years ago when the Institute was formed, life expectancy for men was 63. For women, it was around 70. And so when you think about when today's 65-year-olds were born, that was roughly end of life. Now, life expectancy at 60 is another 25 to 30 years. So if you make it to 60, you're going to make it to 90. And so it changes the dynamics in household finances. Increasingly, seniors are just running out of money. They weren't expecting to live another 30, 40 years after retirement, and they have, and they've lived a healthy, long life, or they may have lived a life with increasing health complexities, requiring more care, treatment, medication, special devices that aren't covered by health insurance or covered by the publicly funded healthcare system. So that tends to fall on to the next generation. So instead of saving for your own retirement in your 40s and 50s, you're spending any disposable income that you have on paying or providing financial assistance to the elders in your family. And at the same time, you're subsidizing the living expenses of your adult children, or you are helping them pay off their student loans, or helping them get into the housing market with helping them get to have the down payment necessary to get started, or even co-signing the mortgage, or taking out a second mortgage on your home in order to help them get into the housing market. So the interconnection amongst family generations and family members is much more complicated than it's been in the past, and goes on for a much longer period of time than in the past.
And you're right, it's very complicated. So is the biggest factor the fact that people are living longer, or is it really all these factors put together?
I think if you look at any one of these factors on their own, they're compelling enough. But when you put them all together through the family lens, it becomes extremely complicated. And for some, it becomes overwhelming. And even when you look at the data, most of the data that we have on family finances looks at either the individual or the census household. And your household finances may tell one story, but in fact, there may be expenses in another household that don't necessarily get captured in all of the data. So, for example, you may be sending money home to another country. You may be sending money to a student who's living in another city or another part of the world. And some of those expenditures don't always get captured in the statistics that we have available to us.
That's a very interesting point that I hadn't thought of. You're right. We look at our own tax return to see what our income is. We look at the Stats Canada numbers to show what the average earnings are. But you are defining a family as a bigger unit than just the people who live in this house then. Is that what you're saying?
We conducted a national listening tour last year as part of our 50th anniversary celebrations. And we went from coast to coast to coast talking to families about their experiences. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking to families about were some of the things that they didn't even realize themselves were a part of subsidizing the lives of others. So, for example, there may be one family plan for the phones and for the internet and for things like Skype. So you may be paying for grandma's internet and Skype access so she can continue her relationship with her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren, but you never really think about that as subsidizing somebody else's lifestyle. And yet, in fact, if you didn't do that, then they would not have that access to that technology, and likelihood is they wouldn't either want to or be able to pay for those expenses themselves.
That's very interesting. So tell me more about how the Vanier Institute views debt.
When we look at debt at the Institute, we look at basically 4 different types of debt. One is relatively good debt. That's where people borrow money and go into debt for something that is going to appreciate in value. So like a mortgage, one would hope that, and as has shown certainly in history, that that's a relatively good investment and it will increase over time. A bad debt is one where you generate debt, but it's for an asset that will depreciate in value, but at the same time offers the family something else. So, but for that vehicle, you might not have that job. And so a bad debt would be taking out a car loan, and even though the car depreciates in value, you sort of offset that with the increase in income or employment flexibility. The third type is the ugly debt. And the ugly debt is when you're using high interest consumer credit cards for daily expenses, things like utilities or groceries, with no ability to pay those balances on a monthly basis. And that ugly debt begins to accumulate to a point that it becomes unserviceable. And then we've recently added devastating debt as a fourth category. And that's when people begin to rely on payday loans or commercial lending facilities that aren't banks, that take a high percentage of your income, your pay, or off your checks, and you pay interest on top of that. So there's a fee plus the interest. And so that can be really devastating debt for a lot of families, although for some, it's the only option that they may have.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing that as well. Are you saying then that the mortgage debt isn't a significant problem so long as the underlying asset is going up, or is it, again, is it a complicated thing where you've got to look at the whole picture?
Well, again, if you look at households and you look at the average house price in Canada now, yes, the average house price is around $433,000. But if you live in a place like Vancouver, you know you're not going to be able to find anything for anything less than about $800,000. So you have to look at geography. You have to look at the salaries in that particular community.
What's the conclusion that you draw from all this? Is there practical advice that you can give people based on these numbers that you've found in your research?
Well, you know, I'm thinking the things that cause families to go into debt are getting married, having children, getting divorced, and living a long life, which is ironically what most of us really strive for. And so it's not just a simple don't get married, don't be an orphan, don't have parents, don't have children,
die young,
don't take care of anybody else, and die at 65.
Yeah.
It's really not what I would like to recommend to folks. But what I do think is that the more people take control over their finances, the more aware they are of where their money is coming from and where it's going to, the more they take advantage of tax credits and benefits and tax tools that allow you to save money in the best way possible, understand and learn about things like registered education savings plans or RESPs, understand about compound interest and how investing a little bit maybe before you have children will have huge benefits to you in the long term when you're in your 80s and 90s. And it's tough when you're in your 20s to think about what life is going to be like in your 90s. But I think it's important for us to start taking the long view. And at the Institute, we look at each family has a 200-year present. So if you're born today, chances are you're going to be around roughly 100 years from now. And your great-grandparent is probably in their 90s today when you're born. And so each family has this 200-year present. And when you're looking at stock markets, they go up and down every day. You look at them over the course of a week or a month or even a cycle, an economic cycle. It can sometimes be overwhelming. But if we look at it in a 200-year present and work towards building family net worth and family equity, then it changes the likely outcomes to be much more positive than negative. And that requires conversation, that requires education, that requires honesty. And that requires conscious decisions about expenditures and about investments and about goals in your life. And I think that we are often so busy rushing just to get through the day that the idea of sitting and thinking about what life is going to be like next week, let alone next decade, can be a little overwhelming. But one of the things that I've seen a lot of families who are quite successful is that they take the time to sit down and evaluate and assess their goals. They sit down and talk about them together. They take the long view. They set systems in place, even if it's something as simple as every year on your birthday, you take a look at where you are and where you want to be in the next year. If the 10-year mark or the 90-year mark is too long for you to think about, just take a day or two to see exactly where your money's going. If you're avoiding looking at your statements and bills, have somebody walk you through them and help you understand them, and engage professionals who are there to assist you so that it's not this big, dark, scary thing in your life, but it in fact can be, although challenging for many of us, it can also be very rewarding and very fulfilling if we take a conscious strategic approach to the way in which we manage money.
That was Nora Spinks of the Vanier Institute of the Family. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Welcome back. It's time for the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. On today's show, Nora Spinks from the Vanier Institute of the Family described how debt today, viewed through the family perspective, can be very complicated. That's the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. My experience helping people with debt agrees completely with what Ms. Spinks and the Vanier Institute are seeing. Life today is more complicated, with adults supporting adult children and their senior parents, and with the impacts of divorce and remarriage. As Ms. Spinks said on the show, the impact of this complicated modern family structure is different for each family. Those families that talk about money and debt are much more able to anticipate challenges and find solutions. I agree, and I think that's a great takeaway message from today's show. Talk about these issues with your extended family so that everyone is on the same page. That's our show for today. Full show notes are available at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.